It's 7 o'clock, so we'll get this started. My name is Kathleen Kay. I'm the president of the California Botanical Society, and I just want to welcome all of you to the seminar. I also want just a quick announcement that our renewal cycle for memberships for the following year is now open. So if you renew now, your membership will go through the end of next year. And if you're not yet a member, then I encourage you to become one. Your membership fees help us put on this seminar series. They also help fund student awards for research and our journal Madronio. And so membership is really important to the society to keep it going. And so I invite you to either join or renew your membership soon. And with that said, I want to introduce our speaker for this evening. So we're really excited to have Jodi McGraw here to talk to you about some of her recent research. Jodi is kind of like a huge figure in Santa Cruz area, which is where I'm at. I'm a professor at UC Santa Cruz. And Jodi did her undergraduate degree here and is really just like a total expert in all things Santa Cruz Mountains. She did her bachelor's degree here and then followed that with a PhD at UC Berkeley. And sorry, I'm getting a Zoom alert. I'm going to discard that. Hopefully it's nothing. She has really deep expertise in rare plants and conservation biology, especially in the Santa Cruz area. And she has her own consulting firm, Jodi McGraw Consulting, that does really high quality science-based work on conservation and management, rare plants, especially in the Santa Cruz area. She's also been really a force for, I think, educating botanists in the area. So I think that's how I came to know of her, is that she's trained many graduating students in internships and in their first jobs. And so she's just been, she's provided many career pathways to people who want to go into consulting and want to do the science really well. She's been really integral working with clients like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County. She wrote a book called the Sandhills Conservation and Management Plan. That was a while back, and then she's worked on so many different kinds of projects in the region. So tonight she's going to talk to us about her work on cypresses. And Jodi, if you want to go ahead and share your screen. She'll be giving this talk for about 45 minutes. If you have questions during the talk, you can hold them for the end, or you can put them in the chat and I can introduce them at the end, and we'll have some time for a question and answer session. So Jodi's going to talk about the Santa Cruz and Butano cypress. All right, thanks very much for joining us, Jodi.
Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. I'm not sure it was all perfectly deserved, but I'm really grateful for your nice words. And the invitation to share a little bit about this research that I and my team and many collaborators have been doing for the last several years on Santa Cruz and Butano cypress. I would say just at the outset, I see a lot of wonderful people joining, and I'm very appreciative of all your time. This talk is really geared towards it's a talk I developed for conservation managers, land managers, and practitioners. So the science is under the hood. There's a report I'm happy to share with folks, but it's going to be largely conveyed with photos as opposed to a lot of data. So just kind of that's a little caveat at the beginning. So what I'll do though is tell you a little bit about Santa Cruz cypress in case you're not familiar with the study species. Talk a little bit about our study and our two different components. We've essentially studied the effects of two recent wildfires on the species, what we've learned for that about the threats to persistence and some of the conservation management recommendations that are coming out of this. And this whole project is funded by, as Kathleen mentioned, it's a grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to recover rare and endangered species. So Santa Cruz cypress is the genus Hesperocyparis, which is, many of you probably know, it's a lineage that's throughout the western North America. There's 17 species, 11 of which are in California. And the genus is really known for high diversification relative to other gymnosperms, perhaps because of the limited dispersal distance that's typical of the seed. It goes back about 45 million years ago that the first cypresses kind of were obviously originated in the northwest, and then kind of the adaptation has kind of gone, radiation has gone southeast in response to cooling with the late Miocene. Santa Cruz cypress, the Hesperocyparis I'll be talking about, is thought to have originated about 6 million years ago. So that's your taxonomy, and I'm a plant ecologist by training, so that was rough. So the Santa Cruz and Butano cypress are now currently two different taxa. They were up until 2009, that was all Hesperocyparis abramsiana, but Adams and Bartel used ISSRs and terpenoids to pull out one of the 5 populations into Butano cypress. It is locally, for those of you who aren't from Santa Cruz, it's our mascot for the Santa Cruz chapter of the California Native Plant Society. And this map's a little zoomed in. If you aren't familiar with Santa Cruz Mountains, I apologize. This is Santa Cruz is down the lower southeast portion of the screen here, and then Half Moon Bay, if you're familiar with that area, is off the screen. But the whole range of the species is on the western slope of the Santa Cruz Mountains. There's pre-fire about 216 acres in 5 populations. And the habitat is all, they're restricted to nutrient poor, droughty soils that are derived from sandstone, and also decomposed granite, but most of it is Miocene era sandstones that are uplifted in the Santa Cruz Mountains. They co-occur with knobcone pine, another closed cone conifer that's found in the region. They're kind of characterized as being the stands of knobcone pine and Santa Cruz cypress are part of these arboreal islands that occur with primarily an understory or in a matrix of manzanita species, some of which are endemic, like Arctostaphylos sylvicola. And otherwise, these outcrops of nutrient poor soil are in a matrix of more conducive to growth loam soils like that support coast redwood and Douglas fir and oaks and madrones and things with our nice moist maritime climate that we get here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Let's see, the species is obviously naturally very rare. So in 1979, it was listed as endangered by the state. In 1987, the feds also listed the Santa Cruz cypress as endangered. In 2016, they downlisted it, the feds did, because of the perception that maybe some of the threats have been ameliorated through land protection. About 69% of the stands populations are in protected status by state parks and county parks. But as we'll talk about, there are definitely very acute threats now to persistence. Santa Cruz cypress stands are, of course, a sensitive natural community, and the County of Santa Cruz recognizes them as a special forest, which is a special designation and has protection status locally. Santa Cruz cypress, like all closed cone conifers, and has serotinous cones, of course, that open following fire that releases the seed and creates a really nice seed bed for the seedlings to establish nice mineral soil with very high light conditions that they prefer. Cone production in literature was documented to occur between about 6 and 11 years. I'll talk about some of what we learned about that. Cones develop in about 15 to 18 months. from the initial cone production. And the natural fire regime for Santa Cruz cypress is unknown. There's not great records, and it's hard to piece together for 5 populations. But for other cypress in California, I think people have suggested maybe a return interval about 50 to 100 years. Of course, fire is the stand replacing. The cypress has very thin bark, and so this species anyway is killed very readily by fire, and just even the heat from a fire can kill them. So they all die. And so the back to the return interval, some people have said that maybe greater than 200 years can create the risk of senescence, where the seed that would lose its viability and not be abundant enough to replace a stand if the fire is kept away that long. And then on the other end of the spectrum, 30 years or less could create what's called an immaturity risk, where there's not enough seed that's been developed since the most recent fire in order to replace the stand. So that is kind of the stage that we were at. There's a lot of threats to cypress given the very small populations. We'll go through all these. We'll be talking about them later, but there was a lot of, going into the 2008, there was definitely a lot of hand-wringing about senescence risk because Santa Cruz cypress occurs. Most of the populations are really close to human habitation, and obviously this whole region is subject to fire exclusion. So in the absence of fire, there was a lot of concern that they would be subject to senescence risk. So that was what we were all worrying about for many years. And then 2008, the Martin fire was a pretty small fire for Santa Cruz Mountains recent history, about 460 acres in Bonnie Dune, excuse me. It's barely even hard to see. I'll try to get my cursor in here. This orange outline here, it burned about a third of the Bonnie Dune population, which is one of the 5 populations. It's the Santa Cruz cypress. And that area, we didn't really know when it burned prior to that. It could have been burned as part of the prior fire in 1948, but it's not clear. It could have no recorded fire history. Then in 2020, we had the CZU Lightning Complex Fire, which was part of the lightning caused fires that hit in and around the Bay Area in August of 2020. And it burned over 86,000 acres on the western slope of the Santa Cruz Mountains. That's this whole red perimeter that you can see in the map. And it burned all of 3 of the stands and 3/4 of the other stand that hadn't burned. So the only stand that didn't burn at all was the one that burned as part of the Martin fire. So all 5 populations have very recent fire history at this point. So we were given a grant to study for 3 years the effects of the fires, I should say, on Santa Cruz cypress. Given the widespread impact of the fires, there was a lot of concern that if we don't get good regeneration in particular, or that if invasive plant species or other factors preclude that we would potentially lose or have great reductions in these populations. So that was our goal, is to evaluate that. We had the study has a series of components looking at the 2008 Martin fire as a follow-up study for a prior study, which I'll talk about. The 2020 fire, we looked at the effects on the 7 stands that burned, and then we also mapped and assessed all the stands. So like I said, I will focus primarily on giving you kind of some pictorial results for this in this talk. So first, I'll tell you about the 2008 Martin fire. So this is a map on the right showing Bonnie Dune. If you're familiar with that area, it's just an ecological reserve managed by California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was protected because of the Santa Cruz cypress, or in large part because it's Santa Cruz cypress and some of the other rare species there. And the green outline showed the sort of known occurrence of Santa Cruz cypress, and then the burn perimeter is shown in color there. And so, as you can see, about a third of the population aerial extent burned. So that kind of set up what we thought would be a kind of a nice natural experiment to kind of look at the effects of the fire on Santa Cruz cypress. Essentially, this is part of an observational study. in 2011. We put out 10 plots in the area that burned, which are in the red here, and then 10 more in the area that didn't burn. We also in 2010, excuse me, some out of concern of fire in this region by a botanist in Cal Fire, they got together and did a vegetation management plan in the cypress grove. Vegetation management plan is where you go in and reduce fuels and try to do some maybe ecological restoration as part of that. And so the project entailed not removing any adult trees, but just going into the understory, which had very thick downed wood and litter on the soil surface, and removing a lot of that biomass. So as part of this study in 2011, we went ahead and put 5 plots in that relatively small area, hence the different sample size. So in 2022, when we got this grant, it was an opportunity to go back to those permanent plots, and we collected a lot of the same data on cypress abundance and size and condition. We also looked at a series of habitat conditions that in the plots to evaluate factors that could be associated with cypress performance. And that obviously we used both years' data sets, both 2011 and 2022, to try to look at what changed over time, what factors were associated with those changes, and what can we say about the differences between the burned areas, the manually cleared area, and the unaffected area, or the control, as it were. So just some photographs to show you kind of what the cypress stand looked like. These are large cypress trees that were killed in the fire. All the trees that were in the burn footprint were killed by the fire, so there was no survivorship. And yeah, I can see we did have 3 as of 2011. We saw 3 cohorts, so annual cohorts established after the fire, which was great. And some of them were very dense, as in this plot here. This is just to show you how dense some of the recruitment was due to the seed rain and good conditions. So that was really exciting. We were curious in 2022, 14 years post-fire, how the population was doing. As I mentioned, it did kill all the trees, so there was no survivorship still. In 2011, there was about 945 recruits per pre-fire adult. And in 2022, when we went back, about 20% of those had survived. There probably had been some additional recruitment, so I use the survivorship in quotes, but that's more or less the ratio. So we had 189 recruits per pre-fire adult still 14 years after the fire. So obviously a lot of the mortality was due to high self-thinning, interspecific competition, and also some competition with co-occurring species like knobcomb pine and some of the chaparral shrubs as well. For reproduction, we started seeing cypress reproduce in these plots 14 years out. About 8.2% of the recruits had started to produce seed cones or ovulate cones or staminate cones. And we might have missed, there might have been some trees that had earlier cone crops that we didn't detect. So we're just allowing for that. It could have started a little earlier. In the Martin Fire area, just kind of show you some pictures of it. Varies from this really open chaparral to this really dense dog hair kind of stand. This is really different from the manual clearing area that I mentioned that was done as part of the vegetation management plan. In 2011, there was only 5 recruits in the 25 meter squared plots on average. All of those were in one of the plots. There was only 5 plots. And they were all in like one corner that had been raked. So it was pretty much kind of told us what we knew going in, that if you don't remove the overstory trees and you don't get all the bare mineral soil conditions and low shade, you're really not going to get a lot of cypress recruitment. So we did get a few seedlings, but none of those were around or could be detected during the 2022 resurvey of the plots. And so it was 100% mortality there, which was even more than we saw in the control plots, the unaffected plots. So there just really wasn't any kind of carryover or benefit from that treatment. And then, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the adult trees that they wanted to spare because no one wanted to kill trees, understandably, as part of the treatment, they were starting to die, probably from heart rot. Looks like a lot of windfall damage, and so there was already a decline of 35% in adult density over that same time period. So this is kind of some pictures of what that looks like. You can see a lot of the dense litter on the soil surface in 2011, kind of what the treatments look like. They bucked up a lot of dead trees and piled up sticks and made some bare mineral soil, but wasn't really great conditions to recruit cypress, and didn't look too different in 2022. So the unaffected area, this is just the control habitat. You can see the manual removal pretty much looks pretty similar to an unburned stand in many respects. And this is what it looked like in 2022, where we did start seeing a fair amount of windfall as well. These stands are getting pretty mature. So what do we learn from that? I think our big take homes are prescribed burns. If we're not going to be able to allow fire to move these areas, prescribed burns are going to be helpful, or some sort of vegetation management to simulate the beneficial effects of burns. And they're going to have to, kill the established trees, open cones, remove the mineral soil on the ground, or excuse me, remove the litter on the ground and open up bare mineral soil conditions, and that any kind of surrogate is going to need to do the same thing, that it's not going to work to leave trees, of course, and that we are clearly going to need some further testing prior to any large-scale implementation of those treatments. The other thing we were really concerned about with the Martin fire was that that would promote exotic plants. This system has very low cover of exotic plants pre-fire, and as we all know, disturbances can promote a lot of exotic plants that are adapted to the same open soil, open canopy conditions. But we were really pleased to see that even the 14 years post-fire, that there was just a tiny bit of exotic annual grass, Araucaria and Festuca majoris, and some of the plots, and that was it. So unfortunately, though, in the vegetation management project area, that did promote French broom, and that's partly because it was adjacent to a residence, so it's not really a fair comparison. It's more of a landscape context thing there. So yeah, I think that our big take-homes were also just being really mindful about treatments and making sure we don't promote exotic plants. So I'll move on to talking about the CZU fire, which we studied for about 3 years between 2022 and 2024. In 2007, I had done a demographic monitoring study of Santa Cruz cypress, and had tagged some trees and kind of looked at the stage distribution and whatnot in 2007. And our very first thing that we did was go back to all those trees and see if there was any survivorship, and also look at habitat conditions in the site and look for recruitment. This is actually the same tree in 2007 and 2002, and you can see obviously this very large tree died, and we had some recruitment. So that I won't talk about that initial effort, but then in 2023 we went out and established some plots that we used to quantify very similar response of cypress and also habitat conditions as in the Martin fire. We had a little spin-off study that we looked at the aerial seed bank, which I'll talk about, and then tell you some of what we learned from some stand mapping. So if those of you who aren't familiar with the CZU fire, it was a very large fire, very variable intensity for Santa Cruz cypress stands. As I mentioned, it burned 3 stands completely, and another stand, 3/4 of the area was burned. The burn severity was patchy, but that's mostly a reflection of the very patchy nature of the pre-fire vegetation. So these kind of low severity areas in the middle are these rock outcroppings where cypress is essentially growing right out of sandstone. So those had very low fuel and therefore low burn severity. In the areas that had dense cypress around the perimeter of the rock outcroppings, that was a very high severe fire that killed everything. This is the Butano cypress stand, which is the unique stand up in San Mateo County. And this is some photos I got from Joey Santori, and they show the very nice regeneration niche that was created by the fire about 3 months after the fire. So you got very open soil, completely removed vegetation, open cones, and lots of seed waiting for rain. So that was good. As I mentioned, we did go out and look and see if there were any survivors in these stands that burned as part of the CZU fire. And all trees did die once again, except there's a handful. I won't go through all the numbers, but the populations, basically wherever they had rock outcroppings, there were some remaining trees. A lot of them really small individuals growing in poor conditions. In one stand, this stand here is right near, pretty close to a residence, and so I think the fire suppression activities that were targeted towards protecting that residence from the fire helped benefit this part of the stand. So we do have some trees out there, but a lot of the trees are now succumbing to windfall, I've noticed lately. So in 2023, we established 10 plots in each of the 4 populations and measured a lot of the same data, took a lot of the same data as we did for the Martin fire, so I won't go through all those, but our goal was to compare the populations to each other, compare the CZU populations, burned populations to the Martin fire population in Bonnie Doon, and kind of try to get a sense of what we could predict from what the recruitment post-CZU might portend based on what we were able to learn about the Martin fire. So not unlike the Martin fire, we did see 3 years post-fire, 3 annual cohorts of seedlings that established. So obviously that was good news. Unfortunately, the recruitment post-CZU has been much lower. Just a quick graph that shows that the 3 annual cohorts do decline. The very first one is the highest density, and then you had much lower density in the next 2 years. The rainfall had a countervailing pattern. So in 2021, unfortunately, the year after the fire was a very low rainfall year. We saw less than half of the annual rainfall. So it was essentially a drought year. The second year got us almost up to normal conditions, and then we got a really great rainfall year in 2023. But the seed that is released obviously starts to either lose viability or disappear from the system, predation, loss, and so that obviously reduces the ability for ongoing recruitment to occur. So that has kind of set the stage for really low recruitment in the Santa Cruz cypress populations where they were burned, unfortunately. So I'll talk about some of the patterns that we observed rather than showing you all the data. Recruitment, one of the ones that was really interesting is that the cypress recruitment was highest at the ecotone between the cypress stands and the adjacent redwood forest and Douglas fir forest and hardwood forests. I think that's largely an expression of those areas have kind of more fertile soil, deeper soil, loam soil, and also probably an expression of the reduced desiccation stress and just inimical conditions created by the drought in there. So if they can survive these kind of more shaded conditions, I think some of the biggest trees pre-fire also occur in these conditions. It's just usually a pretty low density area. In terms of shrubs, there's a lot of concern about the chaparral shrub regrowth. People are understandably now the hand-wringing is about the shrubs because the shrubs compete with cypress, but they also can create higher fuel conditions that could promote another fire, and a too frequent fire could be really devastating. We did see generally higher abundance of cypress in intermediate cover of chaparral shrub as opposed to like the really dense shrubs. They did seem to be either competing or maybe they were obviously, we can't say competition because there could have been certain conditions there that are good for shrubs weren't good for cypress, but it did seem like competition. And then we did see some patterns with respect to exotic plants, which are not great. Unfortunately, we had French broom, Genista conspecific, if you're not familiar with that taxon, came into one of the stands, and that was not a good situation for the brackenberry population. Some exotic annual grasses and forbs, including Festuca majoris, rat-tail fescue, came in, and this is kind of a pattern. These are all cypress recruits growing in a drainage next to the yellow exotic annual grasses, and so it's just a very distinct pattern of moisture good, exotic grasses bad for cypress recruitment. Some of the cypress populations are subject to trail use. We did see kind of a preferential occurrence of cypress along the trails. I'm not sure what to make of that entirely, maybe just more open conditions. And then trees were, there's higher recruitment underneath dead pre-fire adult trees with cones hanging down. So you can kind of see this dead branch, and there was quite a bit of recruitment around those trees, obviously. And that's just a seed rain effect, which got us really interested in thinking about the aerial seed bank. We did what's called, canopy seed bank analysis, because when we're checking out the plots, we saw, a fair number of open cones that still had seeds in them. And then some trees just had just an amazing amount of cones still in their canopy. Some trees, unfortunately, did have a lot of the canopy burned off, but that was less common. More often, you would still see cones on trees in the canopy. So we were really interested to know if this could be perhaps a way of getting ongoing recruitment of cypress particularly in light of the drought year that followed the fire and the kind of lackluster recruitment that we were seeing. So we recruited a lot of UCSC interns to help us out with this component of the study, where we essentially quantified the number of cones that were in the plots. We counted cones and looked at percentage of cones that had seeds. We also just quantified the seed in the cones, and then looked at the seed viability using germination trials and tetrazolium tests to figure out how much seed was there. We also just looked at the seed morphology and saw some really cool patterns that I won't go into too much, that there is a lot of different morphology in the cone size, seed size. It was a lot of really interesting things to see there that were fun to look at, but more for the what we found that relates to population persistence. I'll focus on that. The plots averaged about 304 cones in a 25 meter square plot, and about 87% of those cones contained at least one seed, with cones having an average of about 59.4 seeds. But there's a huge range in the populations. We just assembled all the data into like this table over here to do some cone math, just to figure out, well, how much, if you take the seeds, cones per seed, the percentage of viable seeds, and how many basically seeds do you have out there. And we found that you had about an average of 51 seeds that are viable still on the ground. I kind of buried the lead a little bit, apologies. There is a lot of seed out there, but only about 4% of the seed is viable. So I think that's very typical. About 89% of the seeds were empty and just apparently not fertilized, which is pretty common. And then about 9% of the seeds that didn't germinate were kind of grainy and looked like they had been killed by the fire. And then there's some other seed that just was undisclosed or unknown cause of death. So despite that low viability, there's still just a high abundance of seed out there. And so we're really hopeful that maybe if conditions can persist, and there will still be some ongoing recruitment, but obviously the countervailing effect of increasing growth of the co-occurring plants is going to be maybe making it harder for cypress to continue to establish in those conditions. So, okay. So how did the recruitment in the CZU fire compare to the Martin fire? This graph here just kind of shows you the Bonnie Dune population, which is the one burned by the Martin fire, and the number of recruits per pre-fire adult in 2011. And then when we went back in 2022, and then you can see that same ratio of recruits to pre-fire adults for all of the stands and the 4 other populations that were burned by the CZU. And so obviously the much lower recruitment, unfortunately, over an order of magnitude difference in the CZU burned fire. And so we are very much concerned about whether that's going to be sufficient for stand replacement, and it all depends on how much survivorship there is, which I'll come back to that. So why was there so much lower recruitment? I think there's a lot of factors. I've listed them all here. I think the Bonnie Dune population has like deeper soils, flatter terrain that maybe didn't wash off the seed as much as some of the rocky populations that that were burned by the CZU. There's a lot less debris and litter on the soil surface, a lot lower cover of co-occurring plants. Some of the trees in Bonny Doon were much larger and probably had more seed rain there. And then, though the big one I think I've emphasized a lot is that I think that the higher rainfall and also lower temperatures post-fire. This region really is seeing the effects of climate change on temperature, which is obviously exacerbating desiccation stress in an already xeric environment. So this table gets back to that question of, will we have enough recruitment to replace the stand? I think I have a couple scenarios. If we see 38% mortality of the recruits, which was based on the mean rate of mortality we saw in the Bonny Doon population, then we might have just 8.4 recruits per pre-fire adult in 2034. I'm just kind of playing it forward the same interval of time, which would be about 4% of what we're seeing in Bonny Doon right now. If the mortality is more like 80%, which is the aggregate mortality rate across all the plots, then that would be just 1% of the recruitment that we saw in the Bonny Doon population. So not looking great for the 4 populations burned by the CZU. I guess one glimmer of hope we were also got excited about is the 4th year, this 4th year post-burn. We saw ovulate cones produced, which was super exciting in 3 of the stands. So that obviously, I think originally I mentioned in the literature, they said 6 to 11 years it would take. And this was just 45 months after the trees had established at the earliest. So I think obviously that speaks to the post-fire conditions being much more conducive to growth to maturity, reproductive maturity, than what you might have had. People had studied previously. They were looking at recruits in bedrock and other places that would allow a recruit to actually get going. That's a lot tougher condition for growth, and you're going to slow your growth to maturity compared to post-fire when it was nice, normal soil and open conditions. So yeah, that hopefully will help get us to at least some seed production soon in these populations. So now I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the mapping work that we did. There weren't really good maps, unfortunately, of the Santa Cruz cypress populations. We had done some mapping in the early part of the aughts, but some of the old mapping the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was working with were all pre-GPS GIS data. So we set out to also just map the stands, and also we were really interested to see how the distribution of the trees might have changed in response to the fire too. So we did have some data that we could work with. We could also look at the pre-fire trees, map their perimeter, and see where trees are recruiting relative to where we had pre-fire trees on the perimeter. So that's what we did, and what the kind of the big findings were. It was a little challenging, I will say, not gonna lie. This is some very steep terrain, some very brushy terrain, some very remote conditions, and very not conducive to on the ground mapping. We did try some remote sensing based techniques, which were marginal at best for the pre-fire stand, and obviously it can't be used, at least with at least the technology we had available to do the post-fire recruits, which were very small. So right now we were relying on the ground mapping, and we found about 179 acres that we could verify were occupied by cypress, and another 141 or 142 acres that were potentially occupied that we couldn't rule it out due to, like I said, trying to climb and walk up some of that terrain and look for seedlings, which was pretty challenging. So overall, we think if we compare apples to apples and like what we know was occupied pre-fire and what we think was occupied pre-fire, it's about a 3% increase in the occupied habitat, but about a 9% decrease in the aerial extent of the potentially occupied habitat. So not huge shifts in the aerial extent. I think really the big story is the abundance is questionable. We did see some new occurrences. I got a little new patch that was found as part of this mapping study, so that was kind of exciting for those who know this area, but for those of you who don't, there's just kind of a new patch. Maybe there's more occurrences in areas that we have yet to completely scour and walk, so that gives us some hope. We also saw some pre-fire stand contractions, some places where people had said, like here, that there had been cypress. We found no evidence of cypress walking through this area, which was very walkable. So this is what we think was like a just kind of an overmap situation that contributed to some of the, not the true decline, but the changes in the aerial extent. We did see ecologically interesting changes, like cypress expanded into the ecotone, which I mentioned earlier. It was kind of cool that trees, some of them were very tall, 80, 100 feet tall or so, and they would fall into the redwood forest, and we would see seedlings establishing in the redwood forest as a result of that tree fall, maybe also wind and whatnot, but you would definitely see trees underneath fallen trees. So that is, if they can persist in those deeper, loamier soils, hopefully that'll allow them to persist. This is kind of what that looks like in maps. We had some, the purple is the post-fire perimeter of the stands, and the blue is the pre-fire stand. So you can kind of see that there's definitely some expansion on the outer perimeter. We also saw some contractions to offset that, as I mentioned, places where we knew there were pre-fire adults, you can still see the snags, and then there's no recruitment that we can detect. Maybe they'll still establish in those areas, but it could be that those could be legitimate range contractions and are not range, but distribution contractions in those populations. Okay, so just wrapping up here, I'll just tell you kind of like what our take homes are about the threats to persistence, which is our ultimate goal with this study, is to try to promote conservation of these taxa. We did, the ongoing development is still a big threat. Can't understate that. There's a lot of protection, but then there's a lot of just things that happen, even in protected lands when people cut down cypress. We saw some grading and roads and some vegetation removal that obviously needs to be addressed, especially on protected lands. Exotic plants I mentioned, not just the French broom, but we had colonial bentgrass coming into one stand. So population, I mentioned some of the other ones. Whenever you saw the really dense exotic annual grasses, you definitely see some signs of desiccation stress of recruits. Exotic plants were impacting them for a lot of mechanisms. Obviously, competition's huge. We're really worried about potential for nitrogen enrichment from species like French broom, the nitrogen fixer, and then the biggest threat is probably the direct competition and then the increased risk of fire. So if we have a lot of French broom and grasses, the flashy fools can really promote return of fire to the system, which would be really devastating given the precarious situation that the species is in with most of the population burned. We also saw herbivory by brush rabbits. When the French broom came in, that harbored brush rabbits, and then they chewed up a lot of the recruits. We did rally the community through this study, the California Native Plant Society and various other community members who are really motivated to try to address some of the threats. So we had to get out there and remove broom from the population that was most affected by that. Some feel-good photos of before and after broom on the left, no broom on the right. So hopefully that will help with the ongoing population maintenance in those areas. Recreation use is an issue and an isolated issue. It's certainly not a widespread issue, but if every tree matters, then maybe it's something to think about addressing. There's some unauthorized, primarily mountain bike trails that go through the Santa Cruz Cypress stands, 2 stands. Climate change is the more widespread issue that we really obviously are acutely aware of, both directly and indirectly through its other effects. So, the increased temperatures, increased frequency of drought, potential for reduced fog, although I guess we're all still waiting to see exactly the implications of climate change for fog in our marine layer. It's really a marine layer that we have here. This is one of the Santa Cruz Cypress stands down here when we were heading in to go do our surveys, bathed in the fog or marine layer in the August. And so you can see that's really beneficial to the trees versus if we start losing that, it's going to make a very different situation. The climate change seems to be dealing us a lot of wind too. Those derechos that we got, the straight line winds a couple years ago, blew down quite a few adult trees that maybe were suffering from heart rot anyway, but just one more effect. And then, of course, increased risk of fire is the biggest one with climate change. The Santa Cruz cypress, as I mentioned already, occurs in some of the more xeric conditions, sandstone, very little soil. They'll grow right out of rocks. It's amazing, but very thin soil. And a lot of it is really exposed. This is kind of just an index of solar radiation. You can see that a lot of it's on south-facing slopes that are really hot and exposed and already prone to desiccation stress. And then you add the exotic plants, which really exacerbates that for them. And then, yeah, the two risks. Now we're like I said, a lot of hand wringing in the early aughts about not having fire, and now it's all about how do we keep fire from reburning these stands, the ones that just burned, which is all of them except for maybe a little bit. We don't really know how long we need to keep these guys going before they burn again, but you know, like I said, people say 30 to 50 years is what you would need, but I don't think that's really based on a ton of empirical data. It's just estimates of when you get cone production. There's a lot of fuels, topography, ignition sources from communities around here that are threatening to bring fire back to these landscapes before 30 to 50 years from now. So that is certainly one of our biggest concerns. The dense shrubs that have come in also are a factor, although they may be playing an important role as nurse plants in some facilitative effect as well. So we don't want to discount that. Fire exclusion is still a risk in the places that haven't burned in any recorded time frame, like part of Bonnie Doon and Majors Creek. Those the small amount of the area that hasn't burned. We are still seeing trees declined towards senescence, perhaps a lot of windfall, as I mentioned. So that's definitely an ongoing risk in that part of the equation. Let's see. So yeah, we this presentation was largely for local conservation management land trusts. The state and local and federal agency representatives are all working in Santa Cruz County to try to address this management issue for Santa Cruz cypress, which co-occurs with, again, as I mentioned, some other rare and endangered species. So we really have a strategy that's designed towards protecting the remaining habitat. There is still remaining unprotected habitat in 2 of the populations. And obviously having as much of that protected as possible would be great. There's also some what I call suitable but unoccupied looking habitat, so that's nearby that I think should be a target for protection. These are probably areas that maybe historically supported cypress going back a long time ago that could still be conducive to expanding the population. We advocate for developing population-based management plans that can kind of tear off this study and general management, provide a framework for addressing exotic plants, recreation, neighbor encroachment, managing fire, of course, being really amongst them, prescribed fire, and monitoring the ongoing effects of the fire. Is really important as well to importantly really ameliorate any of the ongoing challenges that we're seeing out there with the invasive species or whatever else might come the way of these different populations. And yeah, I don't normally go towards, we do a relative rare plant work, so we have done rare plant introductions. It's definitely my preference, you know, to try to manage the populations you have, but I think this species has gotten to such a small geographic range and has so many threats impinging on the populations that it's something to think about would be expanding populations to increase the resiliency and long-term persistence. So it might be time to think about, and I definitely would advocate for some experimental introductions, you know, kind of identify and map suitable habitat based on the habitat characteristics of the species, and conduct some small-scale trials, and then maybe move that into a full-scale introduction, just to, again, not have our eggs in just so many few baskets. There is as I mentioned, some really good looking, suitable but unoccupied habitat. You go out there and say, wow, like why is it not there? Obviously, it's probably, I would say it's a reasonable assumption that there was too frequent fire or some other factors that occurred in some of these areas in prior times. Or maybe we would find out that there are different habitat conditions in those areas. But this is like the Bonnie Dune stand, for example, and there's some really great looking habitat right next to it. So that is something we've advocated for in a couple different places where the populations are particularly small, including Butano, which is the unique variety of cypress that only has one location, which is this 6 or 7 acre stand. This area has pretty similar looking habitat that should be explored. Okay, so there's, as I mentioned, a draft study report that is kind of being reviewed by different agencies and organizations, and we're getting feedback to try to see about implementing some of these treatments. It has all these study results and kind of different colorimetric tables to try to focus management to address different threats in the different populations, which do really kind of differ in many respects. So we kind of tried to lay it out there and help people, different land managers, kind of hone in on what's going to give them the best bang for their buck in the different populations, and kind of made these little scorecards that they could use to again target the unique conditions of the different populations. Yeah, and so we put out a call to action to our community, and hopefully there'll be some work in the coming years here, where I think we're in a very risky time where we probably need to take some action. And with that, I want to definitely make sure I didn't leave a ton of time, but I'd love to take any questions or hear anything that folks would like to share with me and advice for those of us working with cypress and other species up here. Thank you. I can stop sharing my screen if there's.
Thanks so much, Jodi. You've got lots of emojis going on.
All right, emoji fest.
I had a question more from an evolutionary perspective. Do you know, like, is there fossil evidence that these were always rare species, or is there evidence that they had a wider range and contracted?
I'm not that, but I don't know if other people know about that. I think the understanding is that they were probably, I mean, they're paleoendemics. They're probably wider than they are now. I can't imagine being less than 260 acres, right? But I'm not sure that they were ever super wide range. If you look at that initial map, there was a lot of diversification, but I'm not the best person to answer the paleobotany of the cypress. Good question, though.
Okay. Peter Alpert has a question. You can
Yes, thanks so much for helping these trees out. Would it be feasible and helpful to bank seed from each of the populations?
Yeah, that has been done. I should have mentioned that already. So that was some of the early work that I did with the Fish and Wildlife Service in the early aughts. There is seed collections have been banked at Fort Collins, I think, that seed bank for all the populations. So that has been done, and we're very glad it was done.
And just another little question. Has anyone looked to see how genetically different the different populations are as a prelude to seeing if it's really important to conserve all of them?
I don't know how I would think I would look at the to conserve all of them. Yeah, I would have to look at Bartel and Adams' study to see how much that they weighed in on that. I don't know if they weighed in on a value judgment about how important it is to conserve all of them, but just how genetically differentiated they are. I think I would have to refer to that. I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Thanks.
Hi, Jodi. This is Jim Bartell.
Hey, Jim. What could you answer that question?
A couple of those questions. Yeah,
Awesome.
the trees were quite widespread. There's a lot of fossil evidence that they occurred up and down the coast. And of course, the Santa Cruz cypress is in the macrocarpa clade, so it's related to the cypress that occur largely in Northern California. Although we're finding out more. There's a study that I'm doing with Randall Terry, where we sampled some 40-some populations, including all the populations of Santa Cruz. And we hope to have more results on that. You know, it's hard to talk Randall into doing all this work post retirement, but he's not as possessed as I am about it. But anyway, yes, they were more widespread. And the other thing I would add to your talk, we've been, you know, we published a paper about late 23 on Paleoendemic cypress, and the situation is really dire there. I mean, I think people have underestimated the effect of climate change, and of course, in the case with Paleoendemic cypress, is how the groves have been impacted by insects and other factors. That it's just really it's sad. And just recently, the last year's fires, I still haven't gotten up to sample some of the groves that were, you know, we thought were in fair condition following, you know, when our paper was published in 23, they burned entirely. It looks like, according to Google Maps. It's really sad. And the only thing I'll say is, in looking at Google Maps, it looks like I was able to predict Google Maps the extent of the fire that burned in the Santa Cruz Grove, the Santa Cruz cypresses. But yes, fantastic talk, Jodi. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for filling in those data gaps and all your work.
Other questions?
I had a question. I loved your talk also. Thank you. I was really intrigued by how the trees were able to expand into that ecotone land around the redwood forest. Do you think that there's any? Do you think it's competition with redwoods and firs that is keeping cypress from expanding like more into those loamy soils, or is that something that you could manage to kind of shift the competitive outcome toward the cypress more?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I definitely think it's competition. Maybe I think people had talked a lot about the, you know, fungal pathogens. I think back in the day, I'm not sure how much those are really contributing into the. You see seedlings establish and then die, and to me, I'm not sure if we exactly know all the mechanisms, but if it's like competition, fungal pathogens, other things, I do think if you want to keep eventually the redwoods have resprouted, the epicormic growth is off the hook, it's going to close in, so it's just a matter of time to figure out if the cypress are going to be able to, I guess, hang in there in that light environment, I would suspect is the primarily issue. But I think it would be probably be a pretty onerous task to try to manage that, and I don't know if that's the best strategy versus trying to manage exotics and other factors in their main habitat where it's more open naturally. That would be the thing to try to weigh, is how much you want to do intensive vegetation management in the ecotone versus trying to manage exotics and otherwise promote the population where it's already more amenable, I guess. I don't know if I have an answer to that. Maybe it's a yes and. Maybe we need to be thinking about all of it. So yeah, good idea.
Thanks for your thoughts.
Any other questions?
Put my email in the chat in case it's not already available. If anyone has any other ideas, suggestions,
Great idea.
anything to help with this species or related fire things from your work, that would be really helpful.
Okay, well, it's 8 o'clock now, so we could let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks so much for giving that talk. It was super interesting, and I appreciate everyone for coming. And I'll let you know when we get that posted on the YouTube channel also. So
Thanks for the opportunity to share.
yeah, okay. Good night, everybody.